Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name's of course Seesaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 and the Elder Scrolls Online in 2020. Today's video really focuses on the endgame PVE content and how you can progress in both of these MMOs. Now, this video is going to be a little bit different than some of our other comparison videos. There's not necessarily going to be one game that's crowned king at the end of this. We're more focused on how these games are different and how these games are similar in terms of how they handle their endgame content. Because at the end of the day, they are pretty similar games in the sense that they try to deliver more action-based combat with a focus on more horizontal progression instead of vertical progression. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are specific things that both games do differently, and some pieces that you'll probably like more as a player or less as a player. So I'm trying to help separate those differences and really explain to you what each game does differently. Alright, so we're going to handle both of these games in a very similar method. We're going to look at the types of content you can do at level 80, and then afterwards we're going to describe how you progress your character through those types of content. So we're going to start with Guild Wars 2, and this is going to be more focused on a player who's kind of arrived at level 80 for their first time, instead of someone who dings 80 and has like a full bank full of Ascended or Legendary gear, because, well, hey, you probably already know what you're doing if that's the case. So assume you're kind of on your rough level 80 character with not much going on, and you're like, what do I do? Well, there are a few options that are there for you. If you're incredibly rich, well, you can actually go, actually not even that incredibly rich, if you're somewhat rich, you can go ahead and buy some exotic gear from the auction house, or trading post if you rather, and you can get yourself pretty decked out. If you're incredibly rich, you can go ahead and even craft Ascended gear if that's how you want to go ahead and progress your character. It's really nice because you do have a lot of options available to you that way. But if you're focused on doing content, which I think a lot of people are, there are some different options you can pursue. I would say the best starting place for people is actually Fractals of the Mist. For a lot of reasons, they are kind of Guild Wars 2's new version of dungeons, and I say new, but they've been here for quite some time. They're the currently developed version of dungeons. There are technically actual dungeons in the game, and they are good for certain things. You can definitely do them to get some exotics if you want, to get some cool armor sets, to get some cool specific runes. They're actually pretty useful sometimes to get specific runes, and you know, you could really get more into min and maxing and what's valuable from dungeons later on. But I'd say that's a bit beyond what this guide's about, and they're pretty good for getting some gold and stuff like that as well. But we're going to focus on the Fractals of the Mist. These are dungeons that are done with 5 people, and they scale in difficulty ranging from level 1 all the way to level 100 and level 100 challenge mode. So when you go into these, you can have pretty basic gear when you start. You can have full exotics or even less than that when you go in. And the big goal here is you're going to be trying to get some Ascended gear, and then eventually you're going to try and get Ascended gear with Agony Resistance. And what Agony Resistance does, it allows you to go into higher level Fractals and then get more rewards to get more Agony Resistance to go into higher level Fractals again. So this little segment of Guild Wars 2 is very much vertical progression as it would be done in a lot of other games. You're kind of trying to increase the Agony Resistance of your gear to get to the highest level Fractal. Now, the big thing here is that level 100 has been the highest for a long time, so there is a cap where you don't need to get more Agony Resistance, and you'll just be able to run the highest level Fractals to get rewards on a daily schedule. There are Fractals that are marked as the daily Fractal each day, and those specific Fractals will grant you more rewards. So you've been working your way through Fractals of the Mist, and you're wondering what your next step is. Well, the very important thing to understand is that, first off, Agony Resistance that you've been building up for higher level Fractals, it only applies to Fractals of the Mist. So the Agony Resistance really is just a closed loop in that type of content. There is no other place it has any value, and I often thought that would be an interesting way for progression to work in Guild Wars 2 for them to make it more clear steps, but I think it's also nice that it isn't as clear, right? So it's up to players how they want to start. So let's look at the other two main forms of PvE content. We have strike missions and we have raids. Now, strike missions in a lot of ways are probably the stepping stone between fractals and raids. The water is a little bit mucky because you could argue that certain high-end hard mode fractals are harder than, well, definitely strike missions, but also harder than certain raids, and that there are certain strike missions that are going to be easier than certain fractals or harder than certain raids. So it is a little bit, unclear as to the exact steps, but I'd say once you have some decent gear in fractals, a good stepping stone would be the strike missions. Now, you could probably go right into strike missions. You could also, if you had full exotics, probably go into raids, but I think this is the most ideal way to go about getting into the endgame content. Strike missions themselves are your first form of 10-man group content, and I think the biggest shift here is where a lot of unorganized groups in fractals don't necessarily focus on what type of characters are coming into their group. Strike missions is where you start to see certain groups that do care about the specs they have and how they're going to synergize together, and certain groups still don't, depending on how easy the strike mission is, depending on what kind of group this is. If it's one that's trying to clear out a bunch of them really quickly, or if it's a training group, they might care less, but you definitely want to have more of an interest on playing your character right and knowing what your role is. For instance, if you are a druid, well, you're going to be healing and buffing the group versus doing damage. If you are a chronomancer, you're going to be buffing the group instead of doing damage, unless you are a DPS chrono. There's little subtleties here, obviously, but you are more focused on how your build interacts with everyone else. And I think above all, that's what strike missions really offers players who are trying to get into raids, into higher end group content. It gives you a great place to try out how your build works with a group of like a larger group of people. So definitely explore that. Definitely work on stacking and then spreading out when you need to. Work on rezzing people real quick, and just interrupting is a really big thing too. There's a lot of things in strike missions that need to be interrupted super quickly, and it gives players a great sense of urgency that is definitely needed in raids. So it's a really good place to try out a lot of this, and once again, there are specific daily rewards that you can get to help increase your gear and get you more topped up with ascended gear. Alrighty, so you've got some decent gear, you've got a better idea of how your class works, and more than anything, you're feeling pretty cool. The next step for you is to jump into some raids. Now, raids are once again 10-man instances, but they are a bit longer than strike missions. I'd say on average, a raid wing is probably like 3 to 5 strike missions worth of content. And don't worry, you don't have to complete the entire wing to get any rewards. Actually, Guild Wars 2 is very generous with how they reward people. You will get some loot from killing a boss, but you'll also get a different type of shard depending on what raid you're in to buy some gear from each boss encounter. And you actually get different amounts of shards based on how much you progress the boss. So even if you don't kill a boss and you get it to like 10% or 50%, you're going to get a few tokens to save up to buy some gear. So it really does help players gear up pretty quickly, even if they are in training runs and different level experience groups. Now that leads us to our big point of joining raids, is making sure you join a raid that's proper for you, because that's going to really shape your enjoyment in general. Now, typically in any game, there are two ways to do this. You can either do pug groups or guild groups. And if you're able to find a guild group that's very much focused on your level of experience, probably going to be kind of more training or newer players, if you are a newer player, that's probably where you're going to have a lot more fun. They might have a more specific schedule of when they're going to run things. You're going to get to know people. You're going to get to improve with people and kind of progress through a bunch of things at a more consistent rate. But you can definitely do all of this with just the group finder and pug groups as well. So don't worry about that if you don't want to commit to a guild. You can definitely find your way. Now, one big thing to note is how to even understand the group finder. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but one of the big things is that you're going to see a lot of people saying what wing they're interested in, what boss they're interested in, and what type of group it is. And it's not going to be super clear if you're a new player, but there are some key things that you might pick up on. For instance, if it says KP or kill proof, that means they want you to have killed the boss before joining their group. So this is a pretty experienced group that expects you A, to link a piece of the boss or a token from the boss when you join the group, and B, to do it pretty much flawlessly unless you make an error. So as a new player, you're probably not going to be able to join this group or want to join this group. You're going to be more focused on training groups or maybe semi-XP groups if you do have some understanding of how the boss works and stuff like that. And that kind of puts us into another side topic, as this might be a good time for you to look up some fights before going into them. Now, you could definitely argue that with any of the fights in the past for some of the more challenging Fractals, some of the more challenging strike missions, it might always be a good idea to look up the fight before you go into them. I know that's not everyone's favorite thing to do, but it does make things a little bit smoother. Now, by no means do you have to. You can definitely find an absolute beginner group that's going through a raid and just learn it by kind of seeing where you should and shouldn't stand. A lot of these training runs do have leaders that are very good at explaining what people should be doing and how to make the mechanics as easy as possible for new players. But yeah, so once you've jumped into a raid, you go through it, and what you should really make sure you do is loot the tokens from the boss. Typically there's some sort of fragment that comes from it that you can use as kill proof, and that will allow you to join higher end groups further on in content. And at this point, you kind of just rinse and repeat. You join different groups, get some different experience with different raid bosses, and then eventually you'll get to a point where you're able to join more experienced groups that are going for full wing clears. You'll work through the different wings. Some of them are more challenging. Some of them have challenge modes attached to them that do give a little bit of bonus rewards the time you do them, so that's kind of nice, but it's not the end of the day if you don't do those as well. You are going to ultimately get ascended gear from the very easiest of raid bosses, from also the very hardest of raid bosses. So it's up to you how much you want to challenge yourself and how you want to earn your gear. One of the nicest things to remember is that once you do have a full set of nice gear on the character you're working on, you can actually start earning gear and putting it in your bank for future characters. So if you're, on some sort of healing druid right now, but you really want to be a DPS necromancer, you can start earning that gear on your healing druid and have it waiting in the bank for when they hit 80, which is a really cool way to kind of skip a lot of the earlier steps that you'd done if you don't want to do them over again. Alright, so we've looked at a lot of the types of content and how you can progress through them, but we haven't kind of put it all together on a character and discussed what you do when you hit 80. Even more so than getting the gear, you should probably look at your character's build. So first off, do you have all your specific skills unlocked? And secondly, if you have the expansions, and for this video we're going to assume that you do have the expansions. If you don't have the expansions, just assume you don't have the elite specs and stuff like that. But if you do, you should probably get those elite specs, specifically the ones that you hope to run in raid. Now, if you're hoping to run a build without an elite spec, that's completely fine. You don't necessarily need to have it, but it's definitely nice to have it because often in raids you might be asked to do a different role if someone leaves, or maybe your group finds that they need some more heals or something like that and they want you to be druid. It's just really great to have it. But you should definitely put together a nice build using this spec and make sure it makes sense together. Now, there are a lot of sites that will help you do this, such as MetaBattle, and I'm not going to go into which ones I think are the best, but there are definitely a lot of sites out there that give you resources to do this. But you can also do it just through common sense if you kind of want to explore yourself. You just might not be the most min-maxed right away. It might take some more learning and mistakes that way. This is our character. You can go to the equipment tab and take a look at what we got. This character has done raids and stuff like that. He is a bit old, so he might not have the best stats and best stats right now, but it will give us a bit of an explanation. So you'll see right away that I have a ascended piece of gear in pretty much every slot, I think. they are for condition damage. I believe this is called Viper's set, which is one of the better condition damage ones, or at least it used to be. And then it has a condition damage rune in each of the sets as well. Now runes kind of add a set bonus to it, and you can kind of slot those into any piece of gear. They do exist for exotic pieces of gear as well, so you can put those in there. And sigils are the weapon counterpart. You can also see that we have ascended pieces on our back, and it's actually the back items that give you a lot of your stats right away. So if there was a place to focus, I'd probably say the back items. You can also see that I have Agony Infusion in a lot of these as well, so this is a character that definitely went through, Fractals before they went into raids. A lot of this had to do with the fact that I was playing the game back when there was only Fractals, so I kind of built up that gear first and then got into raids. A big stat to be in mind for raids is that you don't want to have too much toughness, because if you do, you might pull aggro from the boss. Unless, of course, you are the tank, then you should probably get as much toughness as you can. The last piece to talk about is the progression system that goes beyond your max level. In this case, we're talking about masteries, and this is truly a form of horizontal progression where it doesn't give you any increased damage or stats. It just gives you cool little features that you can play with. That being said, there are some that are specific to certainly raids. That you can't progress through certain raids without them, so make sure you do have specific ones prepared to do them. One example is that for certain bosses you might need to glide somewhere, and hey, if you don't have your glider, you're going to be falling pretty quick. So do keep that in mind, and just make sure you have yourself topped up, but this is definitely something you're going to want to do even for non-endgame PvE content, and just to explore the world in general. So let's move on to the Elder Scrolls Online. I'm going to try and do this a bit more condensed than I did the Guild Wars 2 section, as this video is getting pretty long, but I have no promises. It's still a fairly mucky progression system with a lot of different ways to go through it, so we'll try and tackle this as quick as we can. Now, the very first thing I do want to note is that once you hit the level cap in the Elder Scrolls Online, you do continue to gain levels through champion points. And I'll talk more about this further in the video, but the big thing I wanted to point out is that you should probably try and get to champion point 160 before you start worrying about your gear. The main reason for this is that any gear you get before champion point 160 is going to be easily replaced once you do get there, and it doesn't take too long. You can get experience in any of the ways you've been gaining experience, explore the map, do some quests, do some random dungeons, some random battlegrounds, whatever you like, but get to champion point 160. Once you are ready to start getting gear, there are a lot of different ways to go about getting this gear. Much like Guild Wars 2, you can buy gear off the guild merchants, you can go and craft the gear yourself, or you can dive into some content and start getting it. I'd recommend doing either open world content or normal dungeons to start getting some sets for your character. Now, gear sets are a huge part of the Elder Scrolls Online. There are a lot of different sets you can have, and some of them will make a lot of sense for your specific role and your specific class. So I do a bit of research before you really focus in on what set you want to go for, and hey, you might have already started to find some good sets by doing random dungeons on your way to champion point 160. Now, it's important to note that you can have 2 5 sets and 1 2 set for your character, and I'll explain more about that when we do look at our gear, but you should try and make it so that you do complete sets, because a full complete set of gear does benefit you a lot. Gear sets drop from particular types of dungeons or open world content, so you're going to want to know what kind of dungeon you want to run to get the type of gear that you need. Now, normal dungeons drop blue versions of the gear and purple from veteran. One thing to keep in mind though is that if you are working on completing a set and you're moving from normal to veteran, you can actually complete the set by having a few pieces of normal blue gear and a few pieces of purple veteran gear. So it kind of does work really well as you progress through the 2 modes of the dungeon. So once you do have some gear sets and you have a better idea of how to do your specific role in a dungeon, you can probably start moving into more challenging dungeons as well as some specific veteran dungeons as well. the biggest challenge, I think, in terms of new players getting into this content for the Elder Scrolls Online is that some dungeons are a lot harder than other dungeons, even to the point where, certain dungeons, version 2 of the dungeon, could be a lot more challenging than the version 1 of a dungeon on veteran mode, which makes it a little bit confusing in terms of, is this going to be a really hard dungeon? Is this not going to be a really hard dungeon? I think the biggest way to do this is A, you will learn once you're in it for the first time and you'll have some more experience going into it the second time, but B, it's probably a good idea to look up some of the fights, specifically for veteran ones, or even more so for veteran 300 champion point DLC dungeons before going into them, because this is really where you start to get into certain mechanics that will wipe groups over and over and over again if people don't understand how they should be doing them. But typically the flow should be, I would say, normal version 2 of the dungeon, normal version, or veteran version 1 of the dungeon, veteran version 2 of the dungeon, and then veteran DLC dungeons. Or you could do even, normal DLC dungeons and then veteran DLC dungeons. And that's probably the way you want to go through it, but there is a lot of variety in terms of, if that's the most linear challenge. Some are going to definitely stand out as being way harder, and some are going to stand out as being way easier, which is a little bit confusing for new players, but isn't, you can navigate it for sure. With that, we move into raids, or as the Elder Scrolls Online calls them, trials. And these are pieces of content made for 12 people, and I guess I should have mentioned this in the past section, but dungeons in Elder Scrolls Online have 4 people, so trials having 12 is 3 times more people, so there's quite a few people that you're interacting with here, and they do feel a fair bit bigger. Now, another key thing for Elder Scrolls Online is that there's normal and veteran trials, as well as veteran trials with hard modes on them. So there's a fairly big range of difficulty for people going into trials, and it is once again kind of muddy water, where certain trials on normal mode are definitely easier than dungeons in certain situations. Specifically, you'll be watching me do the Ethereum Archive here on normal. This is a lot easier than some of the dungeons I have ran to get gear to try this out. So it's definitely not a fluid, step-by-step way to get to a certain level, and there's a lot of people online who've made specific guides about which bosses you should do first, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to those sets that you are chasing for your specific character. But what is nice is that it offers people who are looking to just dive into the story to give it a try, to find out what happens in this instance without having to watch videos or hear from people. It gives you a bit of a driver's seat view of it. The other nice thing for the normal modes is that on a weekly timer, you do have the ability to get a veteran piece of gear just from doing a quest for the normal mode. So it does give you some gear at the veteran level, even if you aren't able to get there. So it's kind of a nice way for people who are trying to get that gear and want to focus more on trials to get that gear. At the high end, as I mentioned before, there is the veteran mode, and on top of that you have specific hard modes to go for certain bosses, as well as different achievements that you might find in other games as well. But in addition to all this, there is a weekly leaderboard for trials, where a specific trial will be chosen, and groups will compete to have the best score going through the trial. These groups will then get additional rewards. So it's kind of a nice weekly thing to kind of challenge yourself as well, that keeps things different and exciting. Even if you are waiting for new trials to be added, it does keep the current ones that are in the game different and interesting each week. There are, of course, a lot of other ways you could get gear, one of the big ones being the Maelstrom Arena, which is more of a solo or group endeavor to get some specific weapons that are quite good for your class. I, however, don't have access to that. I actually just have access to the base game at this point. So there's a lot of specific trials and stuff like that I haven't even done, which is one of the more complicated things I'd say about the Elder Scrolls Online and progressing to Endgame. Whereas Guild Wars 2, there's really only the free-to-play or you buy the expansion option. In Elder Scrolls Online, you have the ability to buy the base game, the ability to buy the expansions and have, all the trials unlocked, or the ability to go on ESO Plus and have the DLC dungeons unlocked, or specifically just purchase out a DLC to do a certain piece of content. And each of these offer you different ways to acquire gear and different sets for your character. So if you are looking to progress even further in the game, there's a difficult choice as to which pieces you want to buy first, and how you want to go about getting deeper into the game. So it is a little bit more complicated for players, but it does offer a lot of different options for you as well. Alright, so now we're back on my tank here, and we're going to talk a bit about how your character actually progresses through the game of Elder Scrolls Online, now that we have a bit of a foundation for the types of content. So the very first thing I want to talk about is the champion points, and this actually matters a lot, specifically once you first hit level cap, which is level 50. You're going to continue leveling in the Elder Scrolls Online, and each time you will gain a champion point. And this goes pretty quickly at the start and then starts to get slower and slower and slower. The current cap for champion points is 810. After that, you don't get any more that add actually any stat points for you to spend. And you can see here in the constellation, this is where you would spend your points. They do give actual stats to your character, so you actually do get stronger when you go past level 50, whereas Guild Wars 2's mastery system, you just progress horizontally instead of getting actual stats. But we'll talk more about that in just a second. The big thing I want to draw attention to is that when you are below champion point 160, your gear will still be weaker, will come out at a lower champion point level. So if you got a pair of pants and you were only leveled champion point 80, they would be stats that are for champion point 80 pants. Whereas if you were 81 or champion point 160, these pants, the drop would be a lot better for you. So typically you don't really want to care about the stats and the sets you have until you do get to that 160 champion point level, at which point you can kind of shift your focus more to actually finding specific gear sets that you find interesting and good for your class. So you can see here that I am champion point 325, and I have started going for specific sets, which is great. We're taking a little bit of a look at the stat points for your actual health, magicka, and stamina. You get to assign these each level, but don't worry, you do get to reset this pretty freely. I used a scroll here in my bag that you get from daily login rewards, but you also get some, or you get the ability to do this in town for a pretty small amount of gold. So it is something that you get to change quite a bit, depending on if you want to shift your build and stuff like that. And more notably, as a newer player, you might want some more health and stuff, specifically if you're with unorganized groups, just because you don't know what other people are going to be bringing in terms of support. So we'll take a little bit of a look at my gear here. You see that I am champion point 160, so these are all champion point 160 pieces, and I have gone for sets. So I do have 2 5-piece sets, as well as a 2-piece set, which are my shoulder and helmet. Now, the shoulder and helmet are earned in different ways. You get these by completing specific Undaunted challenges, which is kind of like a daily quest where they assign you to go and do specific dungeons. You come back after doing the dungeon and they give you keys to unlock different chests to get a chance at getting a piece of gear. It can take a while to do this and get exactly what you want, so you are likely going to be going on to do these Undaunted pieces of, or Undaunted dungeons to get these keys for quite a while. Now, the nice thing is, while you're doing this, you will likely stumble upon some sets that look pretty good for you, and you might end up collecting enough of the set gear anyways that you have a few sets put together by the time you've found your Undaunted keys. But it can go either way. You could definitely be in a situation where you already have 5 sets and you're just doing it for the Undaunted keys. You do get more keys for doing veteran hard modes. You'll get the 2 keys versus just the 1, so there is that. But ultimately, if you're starting out, you might not be able to do the hard modes, so you might start by just collecting the 1 key and then going on from there. One final piece of progression that I wanted to touch on are the actual skills and skill trees in the Elder Scrolls Online, because these work a bit differently than a lot of other MMOs. In the Elder Scrolls Online, you gain experience and levels for your skill trees that are independent from your actual level. So you could be level 50 and ready to go, but you could have a specific skill tree that you haven't used and is still level 3 or level 1 or what have you. So you want to make sure that those are up to the level that you are, specifically for the skills that you're going to use. So if you're a sorcerer who's using a staff, you're probably going to want to make sure your destruction staff skill line is max level and you have all the skills you want to use unlocked. Now, another layer to this is the guilds. There are a lot of different guilds in the Elder Scrolls Online, and I mean NPC guilds like the Mages Guild and stuff like that, that offer a variety of skills that help increase the ability of your character. Some of these skills are very core to certain builds, and some of them are just utility skills, so make sure you do some research to prioritize which guilds you want, or if you even want the guild. Alright, so I think I've covered both games enough now that you have a bit of a vision of what the endgame looks like in either of them. This video went on way longer than I hoped, but it always does that when you're talking about more complex systems. It's also important to note this is just my opinion of how I progressed through these games. If you find a different way to go through it, or your friend or your guild recommends a different way of going through the game, you should definitely hear them out, but hopefully this paints a picture of the type of content and type of gear you'll probably be earning. In this section, I just want to more broadly state the big differences I've noticed between progressing through these two different games. The first and most evident one, I think, is that you can reach your max potential in Guild Wars 2 a lot quicker than I think you can reach your max potential in the Elder Scrolls Online. And this is just what I've found from my experience. It's not necessarily true. You could definitely get a lot of drops really luckily in the Elder Scrolls Online, but I would say there's more RNG based loot dropping in the game, where you might be re-rolling through undaunted chests or running the same dungeon over a few times to try and get the specific stat types you want on your gear, because there's little secondary enchants and stats on there, and there's a lot of ways in the game that you can change them as well, but specifically for the undaunted gear, there's a chance that it's either light, medium, or heavy piece, and you might specifically want one type of them, so you could be running them for a little while. So there is little things like that can be irritating, but if you're someone who is a little bit more interested in a bit of grind, while still playing a game that is more focused on horizontal progression, you might enjoy that aspect. Whereas Guild Wars 2, you might find yourself at a point where, yeah, you have your ascended gear, you have it infused with what you want, and you're like, I could go for the legendary gear and look prettier, but at the end of the day, is that what I care for? I don't know. But that's the first big difference I noticed. The next big difference I noticed was probably the difficulty scaling in the Elder Scrolls Online. They have normal and veteran for pretty much everything, as well as challenge modes and weekly leaderboards for trials, and challenge modes for dungeons as well. So there is a large variety of content difficulty for you to choose from. So if you are a group that's brand new, you have the ability to run normal mode on a lot of things, even trials, and kind of get a feel for them. Or if you've played for a long time and you are looking for that absolute challenge, you have the veteran and then hard modes on top of it that you can do. So it does, I think, offer a larger variety of difficulty, which allows you as a player to really grow with the game and fit in exactly where you feel like you're going to fit in. And this brings me to kind of the last comparison point I really want to highlight. I'm sure there's a lot of other comparisons that you've either noticed throughout the long-winded descriptions of the types of content, and hopefully a lot of other people will bring these up in the comments below. But I really wanted to highlight the mastery system versus the champion point system, because I find these to be kind of trying to accomplish the same thing, but they do them extremely differently. In Guild Wars 2, you have the mastery system, which once again is your way to kind of progress your character horizontally once you've hit the level cap. This will unlock a lot of different things for your character, but it won't make you any stronger. For instance, like firing a firebolt to someone, it won't make that a stronger attack in any way. Whereas in the Elder Scrolls Online, the champion point system does make you stronger for quite a while, all the way up to level 810, and it'll take you a really long time to get there. So there will be quite a ways of, grinding it out to get to a specific point. Now, there are certain points that you'll grind it out to that matter more. For instance, getting to 160 is a really important step. Getting to champion point 300 is a slightly less important but still important step, and then getting to 600 is a slightly less but still important step. So there are little places where this kind of ticks off a bit, and you don't need to care about it quite as much, but it is a presence in the game, and it's definitely something that it feels good in the sense that doing dungeons just to get XP still gives you something, but it feels bad because there is quite the difference between you and someone who's been playing for 4 years and is 8, 10, or even higher. So there is that thing to pay attention to. All right, I think this is where I want to finish the video. For those of you who have stayed this long, thank you so much for watching. Like I mentioned, if you had any other comments, do share those below in the comment section. We love to hear it. If you could take the time to like and subscribe if you aren't part of our community, I'd love that as well. And if you have any recommendations for other comparisons or videos for us to make, I do often draw video topics from the comment section, so do feel like you can share those, and they'll definitely be listened to, even if I don't reply to them right away. That being said, I feel like a lot of people are going to be asking, hey, why did you just only compare ESO and Guild Wars 2 when you've been doing videos that are more broad? Well, the main reason for this is I thought these two games were fairly similar, and this is a question that a lot of people have about them. And then secondly, some of the other games I'm playing, I haven't gotten far enough in the endgame content and progression system to really talk about, most notably Final Fantasy XIV. So I haven't quite gotten there, but I'm sure one day in the future I will look at all of these and do a better comparison for you. But thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you did enjoy this video, and I will see you in the next video.